Today we're sewing up a jean jacket. I actually sewed my jacket today out of a light corduroy, and the sample from the pattern maker is actually made out of the jacquard. So you definitely have a lot of flexibility with this pattern with different medium weight wovens. The pattern I used today is Jacket 101 from the April 2022 issue of Burda Style magazine. You can purchase this pattern as a PDF from their website, and I'll leave a link for you below so that you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and sew it along with me. Just a couple pointers before we get started. If you are using a medium weight woven, such as a denim, a corduroy, or a jacquard, consider increasing your stitch length when you get to the point where you're stitching through many layers so that you don't cause too much burden to your machine. And secondly, remember that Burda patterns do not include seam allowance. So make sure to include that seam allowance before you cut your fabric. The seam allowance that I added to my fabric today was 5/8 of an inch. So cut out all of your fabric, mark those notches, and let's get started. Apply interfacing to your cuffs, your hemband, and your back facing, both of your button band facings, as well as to your undercollar and top collar. On your pocket pattern piece, you have a line indicating where to fold the fabric to create a facing. I've gone ahead and folded both of my pattern pieces and ironed them to create memory creases. And I also took both of my pockets to my serger and serged all around the perimeter of both pockets. Now you can fold both of your pocket pieces along this memory crease and baste the outer edges of your facing within your seam allowance. Now I've also gone ahead and pressed up my seam allowance of the bottom edges of my pockets to the inside by 5/8 of an inch. Also top stitch your facing to your pocket close to the serging. And then grab your center front pieces, and on the pattern pieces for your center front, you should also have a line indicating where to place your pocket. Grab your pocket piece and lay the wrong side of your pocket on the right side of your center front piece. Match it up with your pocket markings and pin or clip in place. Then take these pieces to your machine and baste the sides of your pocket to your center fronts. And once these pockets are basted to the center front, go ahead and top stitch your pocket to the center front along these two bottom pointed edges. Do this for both pockets. Now place your corresponding side front and side back pieces right sides together and pin along this shorter seam. Do this for both sets of side front and side back pieces, and then sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge to finish. And press those seam allowances toward your side front piece. Now place your corresponding center front piece with the pocket right sides together with your side front piece and pin or clip in place. Do this for both sets, sew at 5/8 inch, and then serge to finish. After you've serged, press those seam allowances toward the side front sections again. Then grab this thin front piece, place it right sides together with your pocketed center front piece, clip, sew, and serge in the same way, and do this for both sides of your garment. And then press both of these new seams towards the front pieces. Then we're going to take these to our machine and top stitch all of our seams down in the direction that we've pressed the seams towards. Top stitch both of these side front seams to the side front. Top stitch this new center seam on the side of the center piece. Top stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from your original stitching line. Now grab your front yoke piece and place it right sides together with the front of your jacket and pin or clip in place. You're going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then serge that seam and press it toward the yoke. As you're stitching this seam, just make sure that your stitches are clearing the top of this pocket. And do this for both of your front yokes. And then top stitch both of your yoke seams, stitching that seam allowance to the yoke, and do this for both front panels. Place your center back piece right sides together with your side back piece and pin or clip in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, serge your seam, and then press your seam toward the side back piece. Attach your other side back to your center back in the same way, and top stitch both of your center back seams along the side back pieces, sewing those seams to the side backs. Then place your back yoke piece right sides together with your back and pin or clip in place. Sew this piece in the same way we've been sewing the other pieces. We're going to sew, serge, and then top stitch with this seam pressed up toward the yoke. Place your button band facing piece right sides together with your front bodice and pin or clip in place. Sew with your 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge that seam. Do the same along your other center front. And press this seam on both sides toward your facing. Flip your front piece onto the back piece and pin your shoulder seams. And do this on both sides. Sew both seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Serge both sides of your shoulder seams separately and then press this seam open. Also, go ahead and serge the shoulder seam of your facing piece for both sides, and also serge both of the shoulder seams of your back facing piece. Place the shoulder seams of your back facing right sides together with both of your front facings and clip in place. Sew both of these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Place your top collar and under collar right sides together. Pin or clip the side seams and the outer rounded edge. Sew the outer edges and top curve with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, leaving this bottom section open for now. Once your collar pieces are stitched together, trim these corners and trim your seam allowances. And then turn your collar right side out, poking out your corners. Give your collar a good press. Now take your collar back to your sewing machine and we're going to top stitch along the seams that we just sewed and then baste together the open seam along the bottom. Now we're going to begin attaching our collar to the neckline of our jacket. One of your collar pieces is called the under collar and the other is called the top collar. So we're going to place the under collar right sides together with the neckline. The notches that you transferred from your pattern piece onto your collar should align with your shoulder seams and pin in place. And now take your jacket to your machine and baste your collar to your jacket as pinned. On your buttonhole band for the front facing, there's a line here that indicates where to fold this material in half. I've marked my folding lines at the top of the facing with a pin. So now I'm going to fold back my button band and my facing so that it's right sides together with the bodice and the collar. Right along that fold line. Also making sure that the shoulder seam of my facings and the shoulder seam of my jacket match up with one another and pin in place. Do this for both sides of the button band and all along the neckline. And now you can sew the entire neckline facing from center front to center front with a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way across. Once you've sewn that neckline, trim your corners and trim your seam allowance. Turn your facing right side out, poking out those corners. And then take your jacket to your ironing board, press both of your button bands along the fold line that you transferred from your pattern piece. And then take your jacket to your serger and serge all along the outer edge of the entire facing, from hem all the way around to the opposite hem. On the inside of the garment, align the shoulder seam of your facing with the shoulder seam of your bodice. And with the needle and thread, we're going to tack the serged edges of our facing to the serged edges of our shoulder seam. And do that on both sides of the seam. And do this at both shoulder seams to secure your facings to the insides. For your button bands, pin them in place along the fold that you pressed earlier. And then we're going to do 2 rows of top stitching, one 1/4 inch from the outer edge, and another row of top stitching 1/4 inch away from your button band seam line. and do those rows of top stitching for both button bands. Grab your hemband and fold one of the long edges to the inside by 5/8 of an inch. Place the unfolded long edge of your hemband right sides together with the bottom of your jacket, matching your center back and the center of your hemband, and pin in place. Once you've pinned all the way across, just make sure that the hemband extends a little bit beyond the edge of your center fronts so that we have a little bit of clearance here to seal the hembands in a later step. Sew your hemband to the bottom of your jacket with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Fold your hemband lengthwise at the short end so that the folded edge that you pressed under meets the seam that we just sewed, and clip the short ends. Now we're going to sew these short ends on both sides of the hembands, just catching that fabric that we left extending beyond the center fronts. And now trim the bottom corners of your hembands, and then turn your hembands right side out, poking out your corners. Place the folded edge of the bottom of your hemband just over the stitches that we just sewed, pin in place all the way across. Once I have my entire hemband pinned in place, I'm going to take it to my machine and stitch in the ditch of my hemband seam from the outside, periodically checking the other side to make sure I am catching this facing in my stitches. Finally, for your hemband, you're just going to top stitch all along the bottom and short side edges. Place your front and back sleeve pieces right sides together and clip from the top of your shoulder to the slit marking that you transferred from your pattern pieces. And then we're going to sew this seam as pinned from the top to the slit marking with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And now we're going to clip into that seam allowance to but not through our stitches. And then serge your back sleeve seam together as far as your slit. Press this sleeve seam toward your upper sleeve. Serge both sides of the slit seams separately and press them open. And then we're going to top stitch this seam to the upper sleeve, continuing down the slit of the upper sleeve as well. For the sleeve portion of your back sleeve, fold it in half, wrong sides together. Top stitch this side of the slit as well, making sure not to catch your other slit in your stitches. This next step is not in the instructions, but I'm going to go ahead and place the slit seam from my undersleeve on top of the slit of my front sleeve, perfectly overlapping them. Then I'm going to do some horizontal stitching here just at the top of my slit to make sure that that part is secured. I've gone ahead and serged both of the outer edges of this sleeve separately. Now I'm going to fold my sleeve in half, right sides together, and pin this seam. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seam open. And then repeat all of these steps to construct your other sleeve. We're going to attach our cuffs to the bottom of our sleeves in the exact same way as we attach the hemband to the bottom of the jacket, starting by folding one long edge of your cuff to the inside by 5/8 of an inch, and then placing the other long edge of your cuff right sides together with the bottom of your sleeve matching your centers, pinning in place to allow a little bit of an overhang on either end of each slit. Then you're going to fold that cuff right sides together, sew the end just as far as the overhang, clip the corners, turn it right side out, then cover that inner seam with the folded edge of your cuff. So the same exact process as the hemband, and do all of these steps for both of your cuffs. So when you're done attaching that cuff to the bottom of your sleeve, it will look like this, stitched in the ditch again on the outside, and don't forget to top stitch all around the short and long edges of the bottom of your cuff. To prepare for attaching our sleeve to the jacket, I'm just going to do a little bit of basting at my sleeve cap in case I need to ease it into the armhole. I'm going to start my basting at the top corner of my upper sleeve, all the way around that sleeve cap, all the way to the notch that I transferred from my pattern piece that's closest to the underarm seam. I'm just going to use a 5mm stitch and make sure to leave tail ends on both sides for gathering. Now place your sleeve and your armhole right sides together, making sure that you are attaching the correct sleeve to the correct armhole. Match up the notch at the top of your sleeve to your shoulder seam and pin in place. Also match up your underarm seams and pin in place. I'm going to pin the underarm sections together because I know I'm not going to have to do any easing in this section. Now I'm going to pull my gathering stitches from one side of my sleeve to fit the sleeve from notch to notch. And once you've pulled those basting stitches and the sleeve material meets the armhole, go ahead and pin that in place. Repeat the same steps to ease in the other portion of your sleeve from notch to notch. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew with the sleeve facing me so that I can keep an eye on these gathered sections and make sure that I'm not catching any puckers as I go. As I sew, I can just smooth out the material at the seam allowance and make sure that any gathering that happens within the seam allowance and not on the visible side of the garment. Repeat the same steps to attach your other sleeve, and then take your armholes to your serger and serge around both armholes. The very last steps are to sew our buttonholes and attach our buttons. I use the button band pattern piece to transfer my buttonhole markings onto my fabric, and I've just used pins here to mark where I'm going to sew each buttonhole into my right button band. Each of the main button band buttonholes will be vertical, and the hemband buttonhole will be horizontal. I'm also going to sew horizontal buttonholes in the middle of the edge of my cuff, and note that your buttonhole will be sewn into the side of your cuff on the side of the slit that overlaps the other slit, so your outer cuff piece. Now I'm going to take this to my machine and sew each of my buttonholes. There should be 5 total along your button band, and then 1 on each cuff, so a total of 7 buttons. Now that I've sewn all of my buttonholes, I went ahead and opened them up, placed the right side of the center front over the left, so that I could use pins to mark where I want my buttons to go along the left button placket. You could certainly use regular buttons for this jacket and just sew them on, but I went ahead and bought a jean button kit, and I'm going to follow the instructions on the back of the package to apply these buttons to my left panel. According to where I've placed my pins for my button placement, I'm going to use an awl to poke a hole at each of these markings. And then I'm going to take the pointy piece of my button and poke it through the wrong side and place the other piece on top. And you can use a pair of pliers here, but I'm just going to use my scissors to stabilize the button shank as I give the first tap from my hammer. Just give that a few taps to secure, and do that for the rest of your buttons, and your jacket is all done. Thank you so much for watching this sew along. Make sure to check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next one.